The city hummed with the soft murmur of a waking world. But Nina Howard barely heard it as she walked swiftly down the sidewalk, her son Malik's small hand clenched tightly in hers. The crisp bite of Cleveland's morning chill brushed against her fingertips, but the cold barely registered in her mind, consumed as she was by the enormity of the day ahead. In the distance the courthouse loomed, massive and imposing, its stone columns standing like silent sentinels, reminding her of how small and powerless she often felt against a system that seemed to bend for no one. Her other hand gripped a worn folder, the edges frayed and battered from the countless hours she had spent poring over its contents. Inside, it contained the evidence of her struggle, a pile of unpaid medical bills, threatening letters from creditors, and the dreaded summons that had brought her here today. A routine trip to the emergency room had spiraled into a nightmare. A $3,000 medical bill that had grown monstrous, a constant reminder of her financial precipice. And now, here she was standing on the edge, wondering if this was where it all would come crashing down. "Mom, where are we going?" Malik's voice cut through her thoughts, innocent and full of curiosity. His wide brown eyes, filled with trust, searched her face for answers she couldn't quite give. Nina forced a smile, trying to mask the heavy weight on her chest. "We're going to talk to someone who might be able to help us," she replied softly. At just 6 years old, Malik was far too young to understand the full picture, but there was no mistaking how he sensed the tension in the air, the stress that clung to his mother like a second skin. He didn't know about the late nights spent in quiet tears, or the agonizing choices between paying the rent or buying food. But Nina wished she could protect him from all of it, shield him from the harsh reality she faced every day. Unfortunately, life had never afforded her that luxury. When they finally reached the steps of the courthouse, Nina paused. For a brief moment, the weight of responsibility threatened to buckle her under its pressure. She exhaled slowly, gathering what little strength she had left, before she gently guided Malik up the steps. The building was colder than she had expected. The sterile walls, unwelcoming and impersonal, seemed to absorb any warmth from the air. They passed through a security checkpoint, and Malik, ever the curious child, stared wide-eyed at the metal detector, as though it were something new and strange to play with. Nina offered a faint smile at his innocent fascination, but it quickly vanished as they moved deeper into the building. The main hallway stretched before them, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of cold stone. The benches lining the walls were filled with people, their faces a grim portrait of waiting, some with frustration, others with resignation, and a few with the hollowed look of despair. Nina found an empty seat at the back, settling down and pulling Malik onto her lap. She adjusted the folder in her hands, trying to focus on something other than the anxious churning in her stomach. "Mom, I'm hungry," Malik whispered, his voice barely rising above the low murmur of the crowd. Nina's heart tightened, the words slicing through her like a blade. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "I know, sweetheart. I promise we'll eat after this." Malik nodded quietly, resting his head against her chest. His warmth was a small comfort in a place that felt as cold as the stone walls around them. He was her anchor, the reason she fought every day, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against her. Case 209, Howard vs. Central Health Network. The court clerk's voice rang out, cutting through the silence like a bell. Nina's stomach dropped, her body stiffening in response to the sound. She stood quickly, guiding Malik by the hand, as they made their way to the front of the room. The judge's bench loomed above them, intimidating and unmoving, where Judge Raymond Carter sat with an air of authority. His reputation as a no-nonsense, by-the-book adjudicator did little to offer Nina any comfort. She could only hope that her words would be enough to earn his understanding, if not his sympathy. "Miss Howard," the court clerk called again, her voice formal and detached. "Please step forward." Nina's breath caught in her throat. With a deep, steadying breath, she stepped into the center of the room, Malik's small hand gripping hers tightly. The murmurs in the courtroom faded into a thick silence, the weight of the room pressing down on her. Every footstep seemed louder than the last, her heartbeat echoing in her ears as she crossed the threshold. Malik stayed close, his hand a constant reminder of the life she was fighting to protect. Judge Carter glanced down at the file in front of him, his sharp features unreadable. The room was still, save for the rustling of papers and a distant cough from the back row. "Miss Howard," Judge Carter began, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're here regarding an unpaid medical bill. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Nina replied, her voice trembling slightly. It's from an emergency room visit about a year ago. My son was sick and—" "Stick to the facts," the judge interrupted gently, his pen tapping against the desk. His eyes flickered over to Malik, who was staring at the high ceiling, his gaze darting from light to light, as though trying to count them all. Nina's throat tightened, and she swallowed hard. The bill was $3,000, she continued, her voice steadying. I've been making small payments, but I couldn't keep up. I lost my job for a few months, and well, it's been hard. Judge Carter nodded, his expression unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the papers in front of him into a neat pile. Before he could speak again, a small voice rang out from beside her. Mommy, Malik said, his voice loud and clear, breaking the heavy silence of the courtroom. I'm really hungry. The words echoed through the room, causing the air to thicken with a collective intake of breath. Nina froze, a flush of heat rushing to her face. Gasps and stifled laughter rippled through the courtroom, quickly hushed by the sharp rap of the judge's gavel. Order! Judge Carter's voice rang out, authoritative and sharp. But his gaze softened as he looked at Malik, the faintest glimmer of curiosity breaking through his otherwise stern demeanor. Young man, he said, his tone lighter than before. Did you just say you're hungry? Malik nodded eagerly, his wide brown eyes meeting the judge's gaze. Yes, sir. We didn't eat breakfast. Nina's face burned with embarrassment, but she quickly bent down, whispering to Malik, Sweetheart, we can't talk right now. Remember what I said? But I'm really hungry, Mom, Malik replied louder this time, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The courtroom held its breath, the heaviness of the moment lifting for just a fraction of a second. Judge Carter cleared his throat, leaning forward slightly. What's your name, son? Malik hesitated for a moment, glancing up at his mother for reassurance. With a small nod from Nina, he answered, his voice small but clear. Malik. Well, Malik, Judge Carter said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Court isn't usually a place for talking about breakfast. But since you brought it up, why don't you tell me what you'd eat if you could? Malik's face lit up. Pancakes, he said eagerly, with syrup and maybe eggs and bacon too. A collective exhale rippled through the room, a few quiet chuckles following in its wake. But Judge Carter raised his hand, silencing the noise. His eyes flicked back to Nina, and for the first time, she thought she saw something beyond the usual formality in his gaze. Perhaps understanding, or even a glimmer of empathy. I'm sure you didn't expect this kind of interruption, he said, addressing Nina directly. But sometimes kids remind us of what's really important. Nina swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. I'm sorry, Your Honor, she stammered. It's been a rough morning. Judge Carter raised his hand, signaling her to stop. No need to apologize, he said kindly. He turned his attention back to Malik, his eyes softer now, as though seeing the world through a child's untainted lens for just a moment. Malik, Judge Carter asked, his voice softening slightly, do you know why your mom is here today? Malik's head shook slowly, his curls bouncing with the motion, his wide brown eyes searching for answers. No, sir, he answered with innocence. She just said we had to come here before we could eat. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlacing in thought. He studied the small family before him, the tension palpable in the room. His face softened, though his voice still held firm. All right, Miss Howard, he said, let's take a closer look at your situation. With a steady motion, Judge Carter flipped through the papers before him. The rustling echoed in the quiet, and Nina stood there frozen, her pulse racing in her ears. Her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. Malik, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the moment, shifted his feet, his small fingers tracing the edge of her coat. Miss Howard, the judge broke the silence, his gaze briefly lifting from the file. You mentioned earlier that you've been making partial payments on this debt. Can you explain why you stopped? Nina's voice wavered as she answered, the weight of her situation pressing on her chest. I had to choose between paying this and keeping the lights on at home. Your Honor, she paused, swallowing. Then Malik got sick again, and there just wasn't enough left. Judge Carter's brow furrowed as he processed her words. His eyes lingered on Malik, who was gazing up at him with wide, innocent curiosity. For a moment, the formality of the courtroom seemed to melt away, leaving only human understanding. Malik, the judge asked gently, breaking the tension. What does your mom do for work? Malik's face lit up at being addressed directly. She works at a bakery, he said eagerly, his voice bubbling with enthusiasm. She makes cakes and pies and bread and sometimes cookies. He paused, his expression shifting as if realizing something. But she works a lot so we don't get to eat them. The room softened with quiet murmurs, the stark reality of the family's struggle hanging in the air. Nina's cheeks flushed, not from embarrassment this time, but from the raw honesty of Malik's words. His simple, unfiltered response painted a picture she had worked so hard to hide. Judge Carter leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench, his eyes never leaving Malik. "Does your mom ever have time to play with you?" he asked, his voice now gentler. Malik hesitated, glancing briefly at his mother before answering. "Not a lot," he said, his voice quieter. "She's always tired when she gets home." The truth hung heavy in the room. Nina's throat tightened, her heart aching as the words, spoken by her son, cut deeper than she could have ever imagined. She wanted to defend herself, to explain, but no words came. The judge's expression shifted then. The rigid formality that had defined him began to crack, replaced by something that felt almost compassionate. "Miss Howard," he asked, his voice gentler now, "how long have you been working at the bakery?" "3 years, Your Honor," Nina replied, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I took on a second job a year ago, waiting tables at night." "And still, you've struggled to make ends meet?" the judge asked, though his tone had become almost rhetorical. Nina nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. Every month. It feels like there's less to go around." Judge Carter exhaled, closing the file in front of him. His gaze shifted to Malik, who was now tugging gently at the sleeve of his mother's coat. The judge's voice softened again, an almost playful lilt in it. "Malik," he said, his tone unexpectedly warm, "if you had one wish to make your mom's life easier, what would it be?" Malik's brow furrowed as he thought hard. "I'd wish she didn't have to work so much," he said after a moment, his voice filled with hope. "So we could play more." The simplicity of his answer cut through the courtroom like a knife, and the collective tension broke. A few people in the room let out quiet sighs, and the sound of stifled laughter followed. But Judge Carter raised a hand, silencing them immediately. His gaze flicked back to Nina, and for the first time, there was something more than just formality in his eyes, perhaps understanding, maybe even a touch of empathy. "I'm sure you didn't expect this kind of interruption," he said, addressing Nina directly, "but sometimes, kids remind us what's important." Nina's throat tightened further, unsure how to respond. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she whispered. "It's been a rough morning." "No need to apologize," Judge Carter interrupted, his hand raised in a calming gesture. He turned his attention back to Malik, who was swinging his legs idly from the bench, his earlier hunger forgotten in the novelty of the situation. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling a break. "We'll take a short recess," he announced, his tone shifting. "I'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Nina blinked, startled by the sudden change in pace. She clutched Malik's hand tightly, her mind racing. What was the judge thinking? The 15 minutes felt like an eternity. She sat back down, her heart pounding as she glanced at Malik, who seemed unfazed by the turn of events. When Judge Carter returned, the courtroom hushed instantly. He took his seat with authority, adjusted his robe, and signaled to the bailiff. The man approached, leaned in to hear something whispered from the judge, then nodded and disappeared through a side door. Nina's confusion deepened as she scanned the room, noticing puzzled expressions from the other people present. What was going on? Moments later, the bailiff returned, carrying a plain brown paper bag. He handed it to the judge, who motioned for Nina and Malik to approach. As they stepped forward, Judge Carter leaned slightly over the bench and handed the bag to Malik. "This is for you," he said, his tone unusually soft. "I figured it was only fair to take care of your rumbling stomach before we continue." Malik's eyes widened as he took the bag from the judge, peeking inside to find a neatly packed sandwich, an apple, and a small juice box. His face broke into a smile so wide and pure, it seemed to light up the entire courtroom. "Thank you, sir," Malik exclaimed, clutching the bag like it was a treasure. Judge Carter chuckled softly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're welcome, young man," he said warmly. "Now, have a seat with your mom while we sort this out." Nina's heart swelled with emotion. It wasn't just the food, it was the humanity behind the gesture. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone had seen them, not as a case number or a burden, but as people. As Malik eagerly returned to his seat, nibbling on his sandwich, the room seemed to shift. What had once felt cold and personal and clinical now held a warmth, an almost hopeful atmosphere. Judge Carter cleared his throat. "Miss Howard," he said, his voice steady, "I've reviewed the details of your case thoroughly during the recess. You've been making every effort to stay afloat despite challenging circumstances, and I believe that deserves recognition." Nina's breath caught in her throat. Was he about to grant her leniency? However, the judge continued, his voice unwavering. "I'd like to hear more about what led to this debt in the first place. Can you walk me through what happened?" Nina hesitated. The moment had come. She glanced at Malik, his innocent joy filling her heart with courage. This was her chance to tell her story, to explain it all. It was about a year ago, Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite the nerves still bubbling beneath the surface. Malik had a fever that wouldn't go down. I didn't have insurance, but I couldn't take any risks. I brought him to the ER, and they ran a lot of tests. Everything came back fine, thank God, but the bill. She paused, her voice trembling slightly, as she struggled to find the words. It was more than I could handle. The judge listened closely, his eyes fixed intently on her, unwavering. His silence spoke volumes. And you've been paying what you can since then? He asked, his voice calm yet probing. Yes, sir, Nina replied, her voice tight with effort. Every month, I send what little I can afford. It's not much, but I'm trying. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together as he processed her words. The room felt suspended in time, the tension palpable. Each set of eyes in the room was glued to the judge, awaiting his next move. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Malik, blissfully unaware of the weight of the moment, swung his feet idly beneath the bench, his attention focused on the floor as his mother stood frozen, bracing for the judge's decision. Her heart beat faster, each second stretching longer than the last. Was she about to lose everything? Judge Carter broke the silence. His voice was measured, yet there was a softness to it. Miss Howard, he began, his tone far from harsh. Your story is one I've heard far too often. Hardworking individuals pushed to the brink by circumstances beyond their control. He paused for a moment, his gaze steady. The system as it stands doesn't always leave room for compassion. But today, I believe compassion is exactly what's needed. Nina's heart hammered in her chest. Was she hearing this right? The words felt surreal. She held her breath as the judge continued, his tone gentle yet unwavering. I've reviewed your payment history, your clean record, and the efforts you've made to stay afloat. I see no reason to penalize someone who's clearly doing their best to make things right. He let that sink in, his eyes flickering to Malik before returning to Nina. Therefore, I am dismissing the balance of this debt in full. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a stunned silence that seemed to hold the air captive. For a brief moment, time itself stopped. And then, as if the weight had been lifted, quiet applause began to trickle from the onlookers. Nina's legs felt as though they might give way beneath her, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe it. Thank you, Your Honor, she whispered, the words thick with emotion. Her eyes filled with tears, the weight of relief finally washing over her. You don't need to say anything, Miss Howard, Judge Carter said, his voice softening even further. But I'd like to do more than just dismiss this case. He reached for a sheet of paper on his desk, passing it to the bailiff. This is a list of resources for single mothers in your area. It includes childcare assistance programs, financial aid opportunities, and career training options. One of these programs even offers free online degrees. Nina stared at the paper, her vision blurring as the tears began to fall. Each line on the list seemed like a lifeline, a flicker of light in a world that had often felt like an endless storm. She could barely find her voice. I don't know how to thank you, she choked out, the words breaking apart in her throat. You don't need to thank me, Judge Carter replied, his gaze warm and steady. But if you want to show your gratitude, use these resources to build a better future for yourself and Malik. At the mention of his name, Malik's wide, curious eyes locked onto the judge. Does this mean my mom doesn't have to pay anymore? He asked, his voice filled with innocent hope. The judge smiled, a rare softness lighting up his usually stoic face. That's exactly what it means, young man. Cool. Malik grinned, his enthusiasm like a breath of fresh air. His simple joy drew laughter from the room, easing the emotional heaviness that had settled over them all. As the judge wrapped up his final notes, his tone softened once more. Miss Howard, he said, his words thoughtful, it's clear you've been carrying a heavy burden. My hope is that this small act of kindness lightens that load and gives you a chance to focus on what matters most. Your family. Nina nodded, too overcome with emotion to respond. She clutched the paper tightly in her hands, her grip firm, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. As the courtroom began to empty, the quiet murmurs of disbelief and admiration echoed in the air. Nina held Malik's hand tightly as they made their way out, the heavy weight of the morning now replaced by a surreal sense of relief. Outside, the cold seemed less biting, the world a little brighter. Malik tugged at her sleeve, his voice full of innocent excitement. Mom, can we go get pancakes now? Nina's laugh, unrestrained and genuine, filled the air for the first time in what felt like months. Yes, baby, we can get pancakes. The two of them walked to a small diner just a block away, their steps lighter, the weight of their burdens beginning to shift. Malik eagerly scanned the menu, his mind consumed with possibilities. Nina unfolded the sheet of paper Judge Carter had given her. The list felt like a road map out of chaos, a path toward something better. One line caught her eye: childcare assistance for single parents. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she could pursue more than just survival.